It's a dog, Marlon. Dogs get old and they get stupid. That's the whole story. Except the whole story started on a Tuesday. Every morning before the lights came on, Roscoe crossed the shop, past the lathe, past the welding table. Stopped. Same square of concrete, beside the steel column. 2 feet from the old roll-up door. No barking, no circling. Head down, eyes on the floor in front of his paws. The way a dog watches something move under a porch. Day 3, Marlon Teague got down on his hands and knees and put his palm flat on that slab. It was cold. 10 feet away, the same floor was warm. He mopped it that night. By morning, the whole shop was dry. That one square was still wet. Day 5, he told Wade Corliss, and Wade laughed at him. 2 mornings later, Marlon was at the window before sunrise, and the dog was already standing there, waiting on him. 9 weeks later, Marlon cut a hole in that floor. He should have done it years ago. If you believe the things people overlook are usually the things that matter most, subscribe and stay with this one. And tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this reaches. Because to understand why that dog wouldn't move, you have to go back 1 week. The call came in on a Monday morning, and Marlon Teague lost the job before he ever quoted it. The man on the other end ran purchasing for a plant 40 minutes east that built dump bed liners and conveyor frames. He needed 240 formed brackets, quarterly, same part, same run, 4 times a year, indefinitely. It was the kind of work a small shop builds a decade on. Steady, boring. The exact opposite of the one-off repair jobs that kept Marlon's lights on and kept him guessing 3 weeks out. $240 a quarter, the man said, like he was reading it off a clipboard he'd already half-stopped caring about. You got press capacity for that? Marlon looked through the office glass at the far end of his shop, the 900 square feet where the floor sagged and cracked and no heavy machine could ever be bolted down, and told the truth, because lying about capacity is how small shops die. Not right now, I don't. There was a short silence on the line, and then the man asked if he knew anybody who did, in the pleasant tone of a person who has already moved on. Marlon gave him the name of an outfit in Zanesville. 41 employees, 2 press brakes, a paved lot with a real sign out front. He wrote the referral down in the margin of his work log, because he was the kind of man who kept records even of the things he lost. He hung up. He drank the rest of his coffee standing. Then he went out into the shop and did what he'd been putting off for a month. He cleared floor space near the roll-up door and rolled the air compressor out of the main bay and into the dead corner in back, where it wouldn't be underfoot and nobody would trip over the hose. It took him 9 minutes. He didn't think about it again. He would think about it later. For a long time. Teague Machine and Weld sat on a half-acre of gravel at the end of Foundry Street in Cutler, Ohio, population 4,100 and change. Brick front, steel back, a roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt from the parking lot of the church across the road. Marlon was 37. He'd been in the trade since he was 23, and in that building since he was 25. And he owned it in the way most people own things, which is to say the bank owned it, and he made the payments. His father had bought the place in 1998, bought it as a shell, as a big, empty box with good bones and a bad roof, and spent 11 years turning it into a shop that could pay for itself. Then he'd spent 3 more years slowing down without admitting it, and then he was gone, and Marlon inherited a business, a mortgage, and a dog. The equipment list was short and honest. A 1972 engine lathe with maybe 4 thousandths of runout in the spindle on a bad day. A MIG welder older than Micah. A drill press. A horizontal bandsaw. A surface grinder he'd bought at auction and rebuilt himself over 2 winters. Good tools. Old tools. Tools that ran because he knew exactly how to talk to them. He knew that shop the way you know a bad step on your own stairs. He knew which fluorescent tube flickered when the temperature dropped below 30. He knew the sound the compressor made a half-second before it kicked on. He knew that if you set a level on the workbench by the east wall, it read true, and if you set it on the bench by the west wall, it didn't, and it never had, and it never would. He knew all of it. That was the thing that would bother him most afterward. He knew every inch of that building. And he didn't know the first thing about what was under it. Register. Micah Teague was 11 years old and had his grandfather's hands and his mother's way of going quiet when he was working something out. Every morning before school, he swept chips. Not because he was told to, he'd been told to exactly once when he was 8, and that had apparently been enough. He swept the chips, coiled the extension cords, and put the drill bits back in the index by size, which is a thing most grown men in that trade never learned to do. He asked questions the whole time. Rapid, specific, unembarrassed about not knowing. Why does the lathe cut better slow on stainless and fast on aluminum? Why does the weld puddle look different on cold steel? Why do you tap oil-coated holes and not dry ones? Marlin answered all of them. He liked answering them. What he didn't like was the part that came after, the part where Micah would look at some half-finished job on the bench with an expression Marlin recognized from his own childhood. "Do your schoolwork," he'd say, in the flat voice he used when he wanted something to land. "Get good at something with a chair in it." Micah would nod without agreeing, which is a skill some children are just born with. Marlin said it at least once a week that fall. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. The problem with the shop was the back bay, 900 square feet at the rear of the building, running from the steel column to the old roll-up door. The same door that hadn't opened in a decade because the track was bent and the parts had stopped being made in 1988. The concrete back there was cracked in a long, irregular seam, dished in the middle, and pitched maybe an inch and a half off level across 12 feet. You couldn't bolt a heavy machine to a floor like that, anchor a press or a big lathe to a slab that isn't flat and isn't sound, and it walks. It vibrates itself loose. It cracks its own bed. It kills the tolerance on every part that comes off it, and then it kills the machine, and then it kills you if you're standing in the wrong place. So the dead corner held nothing. Scrap racks, a dead lawnmower, 2 barrels of drops he kept telling himself he'd sort. 900 square feet of a 4,000 square foot shop doing the work of a storage closet. In August, he'd had a contractor out to price the fix. Saw cut the slab, break it out, haul it, excavate, compact, form, pour a proper reinforced pad rated for machine loads. $9,400. Marlin had $1,100 in the business account, a line of credit he was trying very hard not to touch, and a roof that was going to need $3,000 of its own before the second real snow. He'd folded the estimate in half and put it in the drawer with the other estimates. That drawer was getting full. He told himself the back bay was a next year problem. He'd been telling himself that for 2 years. Alsa's was 13, and he'd been in that shop for 11 of it. He'd been Marlin's father's dog first. A shepherd mix from a litter somebody had dumped behind the auto parts store, gray through the muzzle now, gray through the eyebrows, with a back left leg that had started dragging a little in the last year and a half. He was the calmest animal anybody in Cutler had ever met. Angle grinder 6 feet away throwing sparks. Roscoe didn't lift his head. Plasma cutter, air hammer, the compressor kicking on at 4 in the afternoon. Nothing. A customer once asked if he was deaf. He wasn't. He'd just decided, somewhere around year 3, that none of it concerned him. The guys who came around called him the furniture. He slept on a folded moving blanket by the office door, in the same spot, in the same curl, for 11 years. That was the whole point. A dog like that doesn't develop a routine. A dog like that is a routine. So when the routine changed, it changed against 11 years of evidence. It started the Tuesday after the compressor moved. The first week it was once a day, first thing, before Marlin flipped the breakers. Cross the shop, stop, head down. 10 minutes, sometimes 12. Then he'd turn around and go back to the blanket and sleep like nothing had happened. By day 8, it was twice, morning and late afternoon. By day 10, Marlin had started checking the clock, which is a thing he noticed himself doing and didn't like. On day 12, he watched from the office doorway while the old dog stood there for a full 9 minutes, and then raked one paw across the concrete. Once. Slow. Not digging. More like a man rubbing a spot on a table to see whether it's a stain or a shadow. Then he stopped and went still again and stared at the same square of floor. Marlin told himself he had a mortgage, a kid, a roof, a lathe with a bad spindle, and a $9,000 hole in the back of his own building. He told himself that. And he kept watching anyway. Wade Corliss ran a trailer repair outfit across the gravel lot and had run it for 26 years. He was a decent man, a fair man, and the kind of neighbor who borrowed a cut-off saw at 8 in the morning without asking and returned it at 4 with the blade replaced. He came over that Friday for exactly that reason, and he stayed because Marlin made the mistake of mentioning the dog. You want to know what my grandmother did the last 2 years of her life? Stood at the screen door every single afternoon, waiting on a mail carrier who retired in '89. Wade wiped his hands on a shop rag and shrugged like the matter had already been decided somewhere above both of them. Old is old, Marlin. It's not a message. It's a habit that outlived the reason for it. Marlin leaned against the bench and turned that over, because Wade wasn't wrong often, and this was a bad week to argue with anybody. You've got a roof, a spindle, and $9,000 of busted floor, Wade added, hoisting the saw onto his shoulder. Don't go spending your attention on a dog. That one landed harder than Wade meant it to, and Marlin let it sit rather than answer it. But walking him out to the door, Marlin caught something. Wade's eyes went to the far end of the shop, just for a second, the way a man glances at a thing he's already thought about once and decided not to. Marlin didn't make anything of it. Not then. It rained hard the second Thursday, and the roof did what the roof did, and at 11 at night Marlin drove back to the shop with a headlamp and 2 5-gallon buckets. The lot was black. The shop was black. He came in through the side door and didn't hit the lights, because the buckets went in the same 2 places every time, and he could find them in the dark. The blanket by the office door was empty. He swung the headlamp around, found the lathe, found the bench, found the scrap racks, found the dog. Roscoe was standing in the dead corner in total darkness beside the steel column, head down, rain hammering on 40 feet of sheet metal above him. Not sheltering, not sleeping, not going anywhere. Marlin stood in the doorway with a bucket in each hand and water running off his sleeves and watched an old dog do the one thing that made no sense at all. He wasn't looking for shelter. He was standing guard over a piece of concrete. Saturday morning, Micah was at a friend's house until noon, and Marlin Teague did something he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. He stopped watching the dog and started checking the dog's work. He'd already found the cold. He knew about the cold. What he'd never done was test it like a man tests a machine, one variable at a time, writing it down. So he wrote it down. He put the back of his hand on the slab at 4 points, 10 feet apart, moving clockwise, and then did it again in reverse to rule out his own hand cooling. Every point read the same except one. The square by the column ran cold enough that he could feel the line where it changed, a hard edge in the floor about the size of a bath mat. Concrete doesn't have edges like that. Concrete cools in gradients. It fades. It doesn't stop. Then he found the second thing, and he found it by accident. He'd left the surface grinder running while he worked. A habit, background noise, the sound a shop makes when it's alive. And crouched down with his ear maybe 8 inches off the floor, he heard the slab under the column answer it. Not a rumble, a ring. Low, long, metallic, the way a filled propane tank sounds different from an empty one when you knock on it. He got up. He shut the grinder off. The ring stopped. He turned it back on. The ring came back. Marlin stood in his own shop with his hands on his hips and the hair moving on his arms, and he still had no idea what he was listening to. The third thing he found on his hands and knees with a flashlight, and it was the smallest of the 3, and it bothered him the most. There was a hairline crack running out of that square, 4 inches long, thin as a hair on a drawing. And seeping out of it, so slow it had probably taken a week to make the stain, was a dark line. He touched it and rubbed his fingers together. Not water. Oil. What? He got a cold chisel and a 3-pound hand sledge, and he cut an 8-inch square out of his own floor at 9:40 on a Saturday morning, and he did it badly because he was in a hurry, and he'd never once wanted to be in a hurry about concrete. 3 inches down, the chisel stopped. He cleared the dust with a shop vac and looked at what he'd hit, and what he'd hit was garbage, a plate of rusted steel, maybe 5 inches across, maybe a quarter thick, one corner rounded off by 60 years of moisture, the surface pitted and scabbed and orange-brown all the way through. It looked exactly like what everybody in that trade has seen 1,000 times. A piece of junk somebody threw in the hole before they poured because it was easier than carrying it to the dumpster. Marlin sat back on his heels and laughed at himself, one short breath of a laugh with nothing funny in it. 3 weeks, a dog, a cold spot, a ring, and a piece of scrap iron. He actually reached for the bag of patch mix. He was 3 inches from covering it back up and never knowing. What stopped him was reflex, not insight. 40 years of trade in that family. You don't leave a surface dirty when you can clean it. He took a wire brush to the plate for maybe 90 seconds just to see the metal, just because his hands did it without asking. The rust came off in flakes, and underneath it, the steel was not garbage. There was a chamfer on the edge, a clean 45 cut all the way around, even and deliberate. There was a hole in it, threaded, a tapped hole with the crest of the thread still visible under the scale. And along one side there was a machined step, a shoulder, ground flat, the kind of surface a man makes on purpose so that something else can sit down against it square. Marlin Teague had been a machinist for 14 years, and he knew one thing for absolute certain. Nobody chamfers scrap. Nobody taps scrap. Nobody grinds a shoulder on a piece of steel he's about to throw in a hole. Somebody made that, on purpose. And then somebody else poured a floor on top of it. He sat there on the cold concrete with the wire brush in his hand and did the arithmetic that every man in that trade does automatically. To make that one plate in 1946, somebody had to saw the stock, face it, mill the shoulder, chamfer 4 edges, drill and tap the hole, and check it. Call it an hour. Call it 2. And there was no reason on earth to do that to one piece of steel unless it belonged to something. Marlin put the brush down and looked out across 900 square feet of floor he had never once thought to knock on. He didn't sleep much that night, and he was back on the floor at 6 the next morning with the chisel. The thought that had kept him up was simple, and it wouldn't leave him alone. If a man makes a part like that, he doesn't make one. So he started working outward from the column, tapping the slab with the butt of a screwdriver and listening. Most of it went tock, dead, flat, solid. And then about 3.5 feet toward the roll-up door, it went tunk. He cut a second hole, same depth, same plate, same chamfer, same tapped hole, same ground shoulder, sitting there under his floor like it had been waiting on somebody with a bad night's sleep. He was still on his knees when Micah came in with his backpack still on. "What is it? Did something break?" The boy dropped the bag by the bench and came over without being invited, which is what boys that age do when there's a hole in something. "Is it a safe? People bury safes. There was a guy on TV who found one under a garage." He was already down on his stomach trying to get his arm into a 4-inch hole, and Marlin had to take him by the belt loop and haul him back before he skinned himself on the broken edge. It was not a safe. It was a rusted plate the size of a coaster, and Micah looked at it for about 4 seconds and lost most of his interest, the way 11-year-olds do when reality turns out to be flat and gray. Marlin handed him the end of a tape measure and told him to hold it on the center of the first plate and not move. Then he walked to the second hole and read the number and said it out loud. And then he said nothing at all for a few seconds. 42 inches. Micah looked down at the tape, then at the 2 holes, then back up. "Is that supposed to mean something?" Marlin didn't answer him. He took the chisel and walked another 42 inches past the second hole, in a straight line, on nothing but a hunch and a number. and he cut a third hole in a floor he'd already decided he was going to have to pay somebody $9,000 to destroy. The third plate was exactly where the tape said it would be. Micah stood over all three of them with the tape still in his hand, and he said the thing his father was already thinking but hadn't let himself say yet.
"Dad, it's the same number twice."
Marlon put a hand on the back of his son's neck and looked down the line of 3 rusted squares running under his own shop floor. Junk doesn't repeat. Junk doesn't measure. Junk isn't on a grid. The following week, he took 2 hours he couldn't afford and drove downtown to the municipal building permits office. And there he met the single greatest obstacle of the entire investigation, which was a woman named Arletta Voss. Mrs. Voss had worked that counter for 29 years and regarded every request that came across it as a mild personal inconvenience, which she expressed entirely through the speed at which she was willing to move. "Address." She said it without looking up, one hand already reaching for a keyboard that predated most of the building's other equipment. Marlon gave it. She typed it. She looked at the screen for a while with an expression of profound disappointment. 1998. Roof. 2004. Electrical service. 2011. Roof again. She scrolled. That's your file. 13 years of his family's work, 4 lines long. He asked what happened before 1998, and Mrs. Voss explained, in the tone of a woman who has explained this exactly 900 times, that the city switched filing systems in the 80s, and everything before that was indexed by parcel number, not street address. And if he didn't have the old parcel number, then that was a problem he was going to have to solve, not her. And there it was. The whole reason. 50 years of a building's history sitting 11 feet away in a metal cabinet, cross-referenced to a number nobody living at that address had ever been told. He found the parcel number on his own deed that evening, and he got Mrs. Voss to pull the folder the next morning purely by being polite enough for long enough that it became easier to help him than not. 2 documents mattered. The first was a construction permit issued in 1946 to a business called Feldkamp Tool and Die for the fit-out of a metalworking facility at that address. Owner of record, August Feldkamp. The second was a permit issued in the spring of 1978, and Marlon read it 3 times standing at the counter. Floor resurfacing, rear bay, overlay pour. Not removal, not demolition, not excavation. Somebody had poured a new floor directly on top of the old one, and whatever was down there hadn't been taken out. It had been covered up. Vernon Kessler was 74 years old and had spent 40 of those years as a millwright, which is a trade most people have never heard of and every factory in America used to depend on. He set machines, he leveled them, aligned them, anchored them, and when they came out, he was the one who took them out. He'd retired to Cutler because his daughter lived there. He drove a rust-colored F-150 with a magnetic base and a dial indicator riding loose in the passenger footwell, which tells you everything about how retired he actually was. He'd said yes to coming out in under 4 seconds on the phone, mostly out of curiosity about a man who'd cut 3 holes in his own floor on a hunch. He didn't look at the plates first. That was the part Marlon remembered. He walked the rear bay slowly, from the column to the roll-up door and back, and he watched his own feet the whole way. "Your floor changes under me," he said, half to himself, stopping and shifting his weight from one boot to the other. Right about here it quits flexing. He crouched at the first hole with a hand on his knee and rapped the plate twice with the butt of a screwdriver. Hear that? That's not concrete with a rock under it. That's a void with steel over it. Marlon crouched down beside him and didn't say anything, because he'd been hearing exactly that for 2 weeks and hadn't had a word for it. Vernon took the magnet off his belt and started walking the floor with it, dragging it in slow passes, marking every hit with a stub of soapstone. 2 minutes in, he stopped marking dots and started drawing a line, because the dots had stopped being dots. 42 on center, he said, the whole way across. He straightened up slower than he wanted to, one hand pressed flat into the small of his back, and looked at the length of the bay the way a man looks at a face he half recognizes. "Son, this isn't debris." He wiped the grit off his palms and looked at Marlon directly for the first time, and then he said the sentence Marlon would repeat to himself in that exact cadence for the rest of his life. "You don't need to build a foundation. You've been standing on one for 50 years. Marlon didn't answer him. He couldn't right at that second because the number 9,400 was doing something very strange in his head. Vernon gave him the short version, and he gave it the way tradesmen give things. No diagram, no lecture, one idea at a time. Somebody had poured a separate block of concrete under that corner, carried down deeper than the rest of the floor, so a machine sitting on it would push its shaking into the ground instead of into the building. Set into the top of that block was the grid. Steel plates machined, tapped, laid out dead level. "That grid is the expensive part," he said, tapping the soapstone line with the toe of his boot. "The concrete's just concrete. The grid takes a surveyor and a crew and 3 days of somebody's life, and it's the reason a shop like this used to cost what a house cost." He let that land, and then he said the thing that kept the story open. "What I can't tell you is what it was holding." Marlon looked up at him from the floor. "Grid this size, 42 on center. That's not a drill press. That's not a lathe." Vernon squinted down the soapstone line toward the roll-up door, and for the first time all morning he sounded less than certain. "That's a lot of anchor for one machine. More than I'd expect." They knew what it was. Neither one of them knew what it was for. They sat on the tailgate afterward with the shop door open and the light going orange, and Marlon asked the question he'd been carrying since a Tuesday in September. "Then what's the dog doing?" Vernon looked over at Roscoe, who was lying on the blanket by the office door with his chin flat on the concrete, doing an outstanding impression of furniture. "Nothing mystical about it," he said, and he said it kindly, but he said it like a man closing a lid. "Steel doesn't hold heat the way concrete does. Cold floor and 60-year-old oil coming up through a crack. You can't smell that. He can smell it from the front door." Marlon shook his head slowly, and then he said the thing that had been bothering him for 3 weeks. "He's never laid down on it." He nodded at the square by the column. "Not once. 13-year-old dog with a bad leg finds a cool patch of floor, Vernon. He lays on it. This one stands." Vernon stopped with his coffee halfway up, and for a second he looked less like an expert and more like a man being asked a question he hadn't prepared for. "Then it's not the temperature that's got him," he admitted. "Something down there's moving." He turned it over for a while, and what he came back with he offered as a guess, and said so twice. "A mass that size doesn't hum on its own. It hums when something's driving it. Something low, something running steady, sitting right on top of it. Your lathe won't do it. Your lathe's bolted to the building slab and it runs in bursts." Marlon turned his head and looked at the air compressor in the far corner, 9 feet from the column, exactly where he'd rolled it out of the way on a Monday afternoon in September. "I moved that thing the day before he started." Vernon set the coffee down on the tailgate and didn't say anything for a moment. "Then I'd say you switched it on yourself, son. You just weren't built to hear it." Marlon sat with that for a while, and then he asked the only question that actually paid the bills: what it would cost to open the grid up, check it, and put a machine on it. Vernon did the arithmetic out loud: saw and break the overlay in the bay, chase and retap the anchor threads, clean and inspect the block, epoxy grout the plates back to level. 1,200. Assuming the block's sound, and I'd bet a truck it is. $9,400, sitting in a folded estimate in a drawer full of folded estimates. Marlon looked back at the blanket by the office door. He knew. The scrap man came for the drops barrel the way he came every month, and he'd heard about the plates because by then everybody on Foundry Street had heard about the plates. He offered $300, cash, to pull whatever iron was under there and haul it. "Cast and plate, that's all that ever is," he said, thumbing at the holes without looking at them. "You'll get 300 and a flat floor out of it. That's a good day." Marlon stood there holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and thought about how close he'd come to being the man who took the 300. He told him no, politely, twice. The blueprints took a phone call to a woman at the County Historical Society who'd been waiting her entire professional life for somebody to ask about Feldkamp tool and die. They came in a cardboard tube, 6 sheets, linen-backed, blue with white lines, dated November 1946, and stamped with the seal of a mechanical engineering firm out of Columbus that had gone out of business before Marlon's father was born. He and Micah spread them across the welding table with magnets on the corners. It was all there. The building they were standing in, drawn by hand 40 years before either of them existed. Feldkamp had run a line shaft shop, a single large motor at one end driving an overhead shaft and belts dropping off that shaft to every machine on the floor. Lathes, drill presses, grinders, a power press. One motor, 12 machines, 100 feet of leather. The drawings showed the shaft line. They showed the pillow block bearing locations. And they showed in the rear bay a heavy rectangle labeled in a draftsman's precise hand. Micah read it off upside down the way kids do. Why would anybody bury all of this? Marlon gave him the honest answer, which was that nobody buried it. Feldkamp closed in 1971. The building sat, and then a parts distributor rented it from 1972 to 1997 and used it as a warehouse. A warehouse doesn't need a machine bed. A warehouse needs a floor a pallet jack can roll across. So in 1978, somebody poured 2 inches of concrete over the whole rear bay and made it flat. And that was the last time any human being on Earth thought about what was underneath. And Marlon's father had bought a warehouse in 1998. Nobody had told him it used to be a tool and die shop. Why would they? They were rolling the sheets back up when Micah stopped on sheet 4. There was a note in the margin. Pencil, faded almost to nothing, in a different hand than the drawing. The handwriting of somebody who had been standing in this building with a job to do. Marlon turned the desk lamp on it and read it out loud, slowly, one word at a time. Press pit capped. Anchors left set. Access plate 14 inches below grade, north column. He read it again. Because Vernon had told him about an anchor grid. A grid is flat. A grid is a pattern of plates 2 inches under a floor. Nobody had said anything about a pit. Marlon stood in his own shop at 9 o'clock at night with a 50-year-old pencil mark under his thumb and understood that whatever was under that floor was not a grid at all. It was the top of something. Memphis. You cannot legally saw-cut a structural slab in a commercial building in Ohio because you feel like it. And Marlon Teague was not the kind of man who was going to find that out afterward. So he went back downtown and he stood at the counter and he waited for Arletta Voss to be inconvenienced by him again. She wasn't. She reached under the counter before he'd finished his first sentence and put a manila folder on the laminate and squared it up with 2 fingers. 1978 overlay, she said. There's a second sheet nobody scanned. Engineer's letter. It's in there. Marlon looked at the folder, then at her, and asked why she'd gone and found it. Because you're going to come back in here in 3 weeks and ask me for it, she said, already reaching for the next form. And I'd rather do it once. That was as close to enthusiasm as that counter had produced in 29 years, and Marlon took it as the gift it was. The letter, dated April 1978, confirmed in 2 dry paragraphs that the existing rear bay machine foundation had been surveyed, found sound, and left in place, with the overlay pour bonded only to the surrounding slab. In writing, signed and sealed, for 48 years. The permit cost him $85. The concrete crew, 2 men, 1 saw, 1 skid steer, a licensed outfit out of Marietta, cost him $400, and they came on a Saturday in the 3rd week of October. Vernon Kessler was there at 7:15 with a laser level and a thermos, and he was not going to be leaving. Micah marked the cut lines with a chalk box the night before, and did it twice because his father made him check every measurement against the blueprint before he'd let a saw touch anything. The morning went the way that work goes. Dust, then water, then slurry. The scream of a 14-inch diamond blade going through 2 inches of 1978 concrete, the sound bouncing off 40 feet of sheet metal until nobody could hear anybody, and every conversation happened in hand signals. They cut it in 11 sections. The skid steer lifted the first 6 and set them out in the gravel lot, and underneath them, exactly as promised, was the anchor grid. Plates on 42-inch centers, gray with old grease, threads packed with grit. Which was what everybody expected, and Marlin felt the small, flat disappointment of a man whose prediction has come true. Then they lifted Section 7, and everything changed. There was a hole in the floor. Not a void, not a soft spot. A rectangular pit, formed and finished, 30 inches deep, with concrete walls poured smooth and true, and a steel channel frame around the lip, sitting in the middle of the rear bay under 2 inches of overlay and 1 lifetime of nobody wondering. The saw crew shut down without being asked. One of them took his hard hat off, which is a thing men in that trade do without knowing they're doing it. Vernon Kessler got down on the edge of that pit at 74 years old, and he laughed out loud. One short, delighted crack of a laugh that echoed off the roll-up door. "There's your answer," he said, pointing with the whole flat of his hand. "That's what all that anchor was for." What was in there had been in there since 1946. 2 cast-iron pillow blocks mounted on machined pedestals, still bolted down, still in line. A steel trough running the length of the pit, half filled with sludge that had once been whey oil. Foundation bolts standing up out of the mass in a grid. 16 of them, 1 1/4 inches, with the threads gray and packed, but every single one of them straight. And across the far end, a bed plate. 1 piece of cast iron the size of a kitchen table, ribbed underneath, ground flat on top, with a raised boss at each corner where a machine had once sat down and stayed for 25 years. It wasn't a piece of a machine. It was the place a machine went. Vernon walked them through it standing on the lip, pointing with a piece of soapstone, and the size of what he was describing kept getting bigger the longer he talked. The pit wasn't for one lathe. The trough carried the lubrication for the whole line shaft. The pillow blocks were the line shaft's bearings, the drive end of a system that had reached out from that back corner and turned every machine in the building through 100 feet of leather belting. Feldkamp hadn't put a machine in that corner. He'd put the heart of the shop in that corner and built it a room, and then poured 30 tons of concrete under it so it would never move. "This is what your building was for," Vernon said, and he said it quietly, which made it worse. "Everything else in here was hung off this." Marlin looked at the pit and thought about his father, who had swept that floor for 11 years and died without ever knowing. Marlin Teague stood on the edge of his own floor and looked down into a room he had walked over 5 days a week for 13 years. Micah crouched at the lip with both hands on his knees, staring, and said the only thing worth saying. "This was under us the whole time." Marlin put a hand on his son's shoulder and didn't correct him, because for once, there was nothing to correct. Roscoe came over about 20 minutes later. He came the way he came everywhere now, slow, the back left leg dragging a half beat behind the rest of him, crossing the shop past the lathe and past the welding table. Nobody called him. Nobody was watching him. The saw crew was coiling hose, and Vernon was on his knees with a wire brush, and Micah was counting anchor bolts out loud. The old dog walked to the edge of the pit. He put his nose down over the lip and held it there for a long moment, in that open air that hadn't moved in half a century. Then he stepped back 2 feet, and he laid down. Chin on the concrete, eyes half shut. 9 weeks, 7 days a week, and he laid down on that floor for the first time. Marlin watched him do it and didn't say a word about it to anybody. Not that day. Not for a long time after. The restoration took 3 weekends, and it was the best 3 weekends of that year. Micah did the plates, all 16 of them, and both pillow blocks, and the whole length of the trough. Brass brush, solvent, rags, on his knees in the pit with a headlamp on like a coal miner. 60 years of hardened grease came off in gray curls. Underneath it, the cast iron was clean. He marked every anchor with a number in white paint marker, 1 through 16 in his own handwriting, and those numbers are still on them. Vernon taught him to chase a thread, how to start a tap square, how to back it off a quarter turn for every half turn in, how to feel the difference between a tap that's cutting and a tap that's about to break. Micah broke one anyway on anchor number 9 by leaning on the wrench because it was going slow and he was 11. The sound it made was small and final, and the boy went red to the ears and wouldn't look at either of them. Vernon took the wrench out of his hands and told him that every man on that floor had snapped a tap in a hole he cared about, and that the difference between a machinist and everybody else is not that he doesn't break things. It's what he does in the 90 seconds after. Then he showed him how to get it out. 15 of the 16 anchors cleaned up. Number 9 had to be drilled and reset with epoxy, and that was the worst of it. And it was Micah's, and both of them knew it. Marlin stood on the edge and watched his 11-year-old son and a 74-year-old millwright argue cheerfully about thread pitch for 40 minutes. He didn't say anything about schoolwork. Not that Saturday, not the next one either. The final number, all in, was $1,187. $400 for the saw crew, $85 for the permit, $310 for taps, grout, solvent, and rental on the leveling gear, $392 for a steel adapter subplate, cut and drilled on his own lathe and mill in 2 evenings, because a 1946 bolt pattern does not match a 1962 bolt pattern and never will. $1,187 against $9,400, folded in half, in a drawer full of folded estimates.
Mum.
The press came out of a closed shop in Steubenville, a 60-ton hydraulic H-frame built in 1962, and Marlin got it for $1,900 because nobody else could take it. That's not a figure of speech. 2 other buyers had looked at it and walked, and the auctioneer told him why without being asked. You can't put a machine like that on a normal slab. You need a bed for it. Nobody's got a bed for it. Marlin paid cash and didn't explain. They set it on a Thursday in November. Vernon ran the alignment because Vernon was never going to let anybody else run the alignment, sighting the level across the bed plate and shimming and rechecking for 3 hours while Marlin and a rigger held their breath. The adapter plate went down over the 1946 grid. The press went down over the adapter plate. 16 anchors torqued in a star pattern in a bed that had been waiting since Truman was president. When they pulled the level for the last time, the machine was within 0.02 across 36 inches. Vernon looked at the indicator, then at the pit, then at Marlin, and he shook his head slowly. Whoever poured this, he said, was better at his job than most people are at anything. Marlin called the plant east of town in the first week of December. The quarterly order for 240 brackets had already gone out for the winter run. He got the spring one. He ran into Wade Corliss at the parts counter in January, both of them waiting on the same clerk and the same slow computer. Wade asked about the rear bay. Marlin told him it was running. "Heard you pulled some old iron out of that floor," Wade said, turning a hose fitting over in his fingers and not looking up from it. Marlin told him it wasn't pulled out, told him it was still down there, all of it, and that the whole thing had been sitting under that shop since 1946, waiting on somebody to figure out where the problem actually was. Wade set the fitting down on the counter and looked at him for a second. Not embarrassed exactly, but quieter than usual. "I should have taken that dog seriously." He said it plainly, without softening it, which was the most decent thing he could have done with it. Marlin shrugged and told him the truth, which was that he'd very nearly mixed a bag of patch and covered the whole thing back up on a Saturday morning in September. "Probably," he said, "but I almost didn't either." He never got rich from it. That was never what it was. He paid the line of credit down to nothing by March. He put a new spindle bearing set in the 1972 lathe in January with money that had been earmarked for concrete. He brought a part-time guy in 2 days a week starting in April, a kid out of the Votech program who could weld better than he could measure. The roof still leaks in one place. He'll get to it. But on a morning in late April, with the roll-up door finally rebuilt and standing open, and the light coming across the gravel lot in long, flat bars, Micah was standing in that corner of the shop looking at the press, and he asked the question he'd been saving. Do you think Roscoe knew what was under there the whole time? Marlin watched the old dog make his slow way across the shop in the morning light, favoring that back left leg, heading for the warm patch by the office door. I think he knew something was wrong, he said. He just kept bringing me back to it until I finally listened. Micah thought about that for a while, wiping grease off a wrench he was still too young to own. Isn't that what good mechanics do? Marlin looked at his son, then at the press, bolted down into a bed older than either of them. Then at that square of floor by the steel column, the one 100 people had walked across without once wondering what it was holding up. Yeah, he said, that's exactly what good mechanics do. Old work, done well, by men whose names nobody kept. Sitting 2 inches under the surface for 50 years, waiting on somebody patient enough to notice the signs before deciding there was nothing there. Good craftsmen don't just run machines, they learn to read them. And sometimes the reading doesn't come from a manual or a blueprint. Sometimes it comes from an old dog standing in the dark, staring at a floor, asking you in the only language he has to pay closer attention. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe. There's a new story every week. And tell us in the comments about the sign somebody in your life noticed when nobody else did.